everyone
We're now recording. So we're going to start by recapping what we discussed in meeting 2. We went through a list of key topics and that we wish to address with this process. I think that we came to a good understanding. We have any kind of more specific questions about what we discussed, or if there's any additions to that type of that work, we'll have a place a little bit later in the meeting to address those question issues. Paul did look into the ability to be able to swap different staff members out on the team. It does seem like we will not be able to do that. Who have in the group who we're going to go with. Hopefully, everyone can continue to participate and through this process with us. As Mark, will be recording.
There was some question about whether Karen and Megan would continue. Both of them have now responded that since they cannot offer their seats to somebody else, they will continue to participate within the subgroup. So we're going to go forward with the full subgroup that was originally formed.
So move in. And then as mentioned, we will be recording meetings. And this will be posted and it will be up for public review. We'll continue also to do the action minutes. We do have action minutes that we drafted. County staff is reviewing them and trying to, or is working through a process by which that can be available for public review, or for public, not public review, but for the public to be able to see what, take a look at them. We get those minutes back from staff. We'll get out to you. I think that this week is lower, and now that we'll have a process in place, the action minutes that come from this meeting will back to you much quicker. And also, finally, so setting up meetings and getting the meeting requests out to you will happen much sooner following this meeting. These processes are now in place. So we're going to get into the final statement about this meeting. We're going to try this kind of brief today, just give you some information and address any kind of really pressing concerns, with the idea that our meeting next week is going to be a lengthy one, and we're going to really get in depth on creating these different overlay zones and doing basically having a workshop next week. So hopefully everyone next Friday has some time to set aside for us to all work together into the meat of this issue. One of the tasks that to the group was to start to kind of define or think about what these different communities and neighborhoods where the opt-in overlays will be in effect to begin. What we wanted to do was, now that you all have an idea of what communities you'd like to affect, or what areas you'd like to affect, we just wanted to go through a brief summary of what we think what designed overlay area would look like and what it would consist of. So I wanted to, Paul, you
has joined the conference.
Hi, Karen. Paul, do you want to go through that, or?
I think now, Mark, you're referring to what would it look like on a map? Is that where?
Yeah.
We've not gotten down to looking maps with the opt-in group. The opt-out group was a little bit further along in the sense of their communities because, well, there are individuals who certain communities have a good understanding of them. It was interesting because we took a look at the maps and some thoughts kind of came forward as an initial response to be asking you as subgroup members to help us identify the boundaries of what will be the initial opt-in zones. When you go through that exercise, we would like to see for these zones that have some logical basis, and various different features that could be considered, what creates a logical map. One of the features we often look to is generally consistent size parcel configuration. Might be one of the criteria that helps develop a logical map. We'll explore how well that works for the opt-in group, but that's one of the criteria that we ask you to consider as you help us to draw the boundaries of these first candidate opt-in zones. So parcel size, generally similar parcel size or similar land uses would be one of the things we ask you to think about. I suspect that zoning designations, whether it's RR1, RR2, might be another criteria to use as you consider what gets included with particular opt-in area. Another one might be generally similar in the challenges that the growers within the area face. What is really the problem that we're trying to fix? Is it about setbacks? Is it about minimum parcel size? But if we can think about what's the problem we're trying to solve and hold that in mind as we consider what would the boundaries of an opt-in zone look like, that might be the criteria. And then probably one it's a little hard to define what is big enough and what is too big, but at some level, if the opt-in zones become truly expansive, then we start to wonder, does that really mean that we should just be addressing or changing the code? So we're not expecting opt-in zones to take in the Laytonville community and then extend 4 miles outside of the community. I think we would expect it to be the Laytonville community. Now, I suspect that saying exactly where the Laytonville community ends is a bit challenging. It's not going to be some really obvious boundary, but we want you to be thinking about those criteria. Does that make sense? And does the group, as an initial response, have any other criteria that you think might lead to logical boundaries for the opt-in zones?
If I recall, I just add one thing that you and I discussed, and this came up with the opt-out group, and I apologize, Casey, I'll be brief. The roads and the way the roads provide access to a community, to and from the community, and if you have properties on both sides of that road included, or conversely, you'd like that road to serve as a boundary or to kind of help you understand where a boundary might be for an area. That's a kind of one of the physical characteristic that you want to consider when cleaning these areas. Good
point, Mark. Thank you.
I was going to say that does make sense. I don't really have criteria to add. In the discussion in Laytonville, we had been focused on essentially a specific neighborhood that is all zoned RR1 and RR2. And so the boundaries of that are fairly clear on the zoning map, and that's generally what we had been focused on. I sort of assumed that during the process of this development we would refine that and nail it down. One of the questions that has come up is that the southern boundary of that area borders tribal lands, and there is a requirement, a 600-foot buffer requirement in the state water board program having to do with a buffer for tribal lands, and so that is one of the questions and one of the things we're going to need to address in this process.
That's a great additional criteria because it does change the regulatory process, and so that might lead to us drawing the boundaries slightly differently, or maybe not. But it's good to be considering that tribal regulatory obligation.
This is Monique. I just wanted to say also to that note that as long as the tribe gives permission, then the person could be in the 600-foot setback. So not like if you are within that you're out. It's just that you have to get permission from the tribe.
And Monique, this is one of the challenges of our schedule is we're trying to move very quickly toward both adoption of regulations and establishment of opt-in zones. I am not familiar with the consultation required here, but I do both general plan and CEQA consultations with tribes, and if that is required, then I suspect we want to get discussions started as soon as possible. So just for the group's process, maybe we need to identify where tribals are located in proximity to any of our potential opt-in zones, and it may be appropriate at that point. At least we should think about what is appropriate as far as tribal consultations right now.
Hi, this is Penelope, and I just wanted to, I'm down in South Leggett and trying to represent South Leggett. We picked South Leggett as a good spot for Tim because we're not close to any schools or school zones or really anything. And our problem is that all along Highway 272 is zoned RC, which is rural community, which was overlooked in the original process of putting together the zoning for growing. Most of the people along this part of the county in the South Leggett area are only looking at cottage growing, and have traditionally done it for a long time. So I'm not really sure if I'm really adding that much to it, but I just wanted to have the RC in your mind because it hasn't really been mentioned much, which is rural community, which is a great zoning actually, because you can do light industry. So anyway, that's my sense.
But there are no provisions currently for, there's no provisions currently for just uses or cultivation within the RC zone.
It is in the sunset, but it was. We had the supervisors up here. One of the supervisors up here and had a meeting and hoping, just like the coastal zone, that it could be put, worked out during this overlay. That's what we on the LA to hopefully help it out. It was kind of an oversight. RC is really good zoning in general, normally.
And RC is authorized. It's the parcel size that's the issue, right, Penelope?
Parcel size, yeah. If you have a really huge parcel, you might be able to. That is true, actually, Casey. If you had, I think it was like 10 acres. Which the problem is, everybody lives in small parcels along Highway 272. They're the large parcels, not that many large parcels that people live on it. It's mostly DM land as you go past the main corridor along the Highway 272. So they're all small parcels, 1 acre, 2 acres, kind of like the Laytonville area in a way, in its own way.
So,
exactly. So it's not. Go ahead, Mark.
And that sounds like a very good opportunity for included within the boundary of an opt-in over area. area. Because if you have a majority of residents living on these 1 to 2 acre parcels, and then they're surrounded by much larger parcels, I think if you were to look at a map at those parcels, you could see that transition from those, or the lack of transition, the abrupt change from those smaller parcels to large parcels, then creates a sort of a boundary that we could use for this process.
Definitely creates a boundary. I actually pulled all maps, and that's how I found out the issue that RC, smaller parcel RC, weren't allowed to apply for their life.
Okay, sounds like a wonderful opportunity. See, what were you going to say? Oh, sorry.
I was just going to add that essentially exactly what you just noted, that it's not a zoning issue, it's a parcel size issue. RC is zoned for all the things that cannabis people want to do. It's just it's the parcel size, so it is perfect for an overlay.
Are also potentially available for doing cannabis business beyond just cultivation, correct?
Yeah.
Fabulous.
This is Janine. I just wanted to check. Paul sent you an email last night that kind of outlined, I think, the components of the ordinance that will be relevant for and I really probably should have emailed it to everyone, but I just wanted to make sure you got it. And it really kind of highlights the districts that are subject to sunset, which include, all the rural residential, single-family residential, two-family residential, rural community, urban residential. So those would be all of the zoning types that would be, there's a few more listed there, and then setbacks. I think those would be, conferring with Casey too, the two main sets of the ordinance that will be subject to change in the sunsets.
Hey, I seen the message at 8:40 last night. What I'm going to do is go ahead, Janine, I'm assuming you're fine with me go ahead and sharing this with the group and with the staff.
Yeah.
So I'll bounce this out as soon as we get off the call, but this looks very helpful. Okay, and this is one of the assignments that we asked for your assistance, so much appreciated.
Yeah, apologies for getting it to you so late.
No, we're just, this effort is really picking up steam, and so we're all going to be needing to work very quickly, so thank you.
Any other questions or comments about creating these zoning overlay areas? So I went out of order on our agenda, and I skipped our second discussion point, which is, as you all know, that we're also going to be doing a zoning exception. We have an exception working group, and we'll be looking to amend the zoning ordinance to allow for exceptions, to allow for relief from development standards that are currently in the zone code that would probably answer or respond to the concern of many people that are on smaller parcels that are being limited by the setbacks that are required cultivation. And so was going to just go through, or we were going to go through, number one, just a very brief summary on the way a zoning code works with allowed uses and what the standards are. And then furthermore, what we think we might be able to accomplish with that exception work and how it could actually respond to the concerns that we're hearing from this group, the opt-in group, and then possibly what the limits then of the exception group are, and then where that opt-in work will take over, that exception work.
Just to follow up a little bit on what Mark shared, we started this, we have not had a chance to really understand how the regulations are working. And, I think probably indirectly in my mind, I filled in the blanks that there are zones where cultivation uses are not allowed, and the opt-in zones would allow uses that aren't currently allowed. I think that vast discussion of the RC development really highlights that it's not that simple. There you have a zone that allows uses, but you have parcel sizes that do. So it's when we, look at end use regulations, we're typically looking at two things. What's the list of allowed uses we own, and then once are an allowed use, what are the development standards that govern that use? And development standards, you guys know this, minimum parcel sizes, setbacks, those are I think probably two of the development standards that you're bumped up against quite a bit. We need to make sure that we understand within the overlay zones we're trying to fix, but we also make sure we understand where exceptions might be the solution, then it's not necessary to create an overlay zone. There's the sense that these two
Yes.
are really working hand in hand, and we're trying to now start pulling apart and saying, well, certain issues through exceptions and certain issues through overlay zones.
And in general, the zoning is quite permissive for cultivation. It's allowed. I haven't yet run into places where there was a zoning issue in which there was cultivation occurring and it wasn't appropriate zone for that. It's more the parcel size and the setback issues, and specifically the issue. It's this sort of hot button issue of residential cultivation, and that's kind of we ended up with opt-in and opt-out because some neighborhoods really don't want it in their neighborhood, and some neighborhoods have it already happening. They really want it in the neighborhood, and so I think it's very much the development pieces that we're going to need to be focused on. And I had sort of assumed that exception would essentially be applied to single parcels and opt-in or opt-out would be applied to groups of parcels, and I haven't really gotten any more granular in my thinking on it than that.
Your way you described exceptions applying to individual parcels is absolutely correct, but the other distinction is exceptions apply county-wide, whereas opt-in zones are just identified areas. So to some extent, exceptions have much greater influence on the broad landscape of the county. Opt-ins are area-specific solutions. That's another distinction between these two solutions that we're working on.
Thank you for clarification.
Yeah.
And this is probably a nitpicky point, but something I just want to say, and it doesn't really necessarily, I know that this group is interested in, exceptions will likely not apply to opt-out areas. Paul?
Yeah. I think that the direction opt-out is going, at least what opt-out group will recommend in most instances, if not all, is that no commercial cannabis uses within an opt-out area. So it won't be a matter of an exception could then overrule. So I think that's a fine distinction. I think the more complex question is exceptions work within an opt-in zone. That's where it gets, there you have essentially two solutions trying to get to the same outcome, but approaching it, how does that work then? So that's one of the details we'll have to tease out before we are through with the process.
Question, would it be potential to use the exceptions to essentially grandfather someone in that's already operating in what will become an opt-out zone? Or is it sort of yet to be determined?
I don't think, first of all, I'm going to, when terms come up that I want to be precise, I'm going to do this. Grandfather in doesn't really mean anything. You can identify uses as legal non-conforming because they were there before the regulations changed, and you can grant protections, more or less protections. It's within the county's purview to be more accommodating of legal non-conforming uses or to ask those and require those legal non-conforming uses to go away within a certain amount of time. I suspect that the only option that will allow a commercial cannabis use to continue within an opt-out zone will be if they have an approved county permit. And then the question is how long before that right goes away, not will it go away. I suspect that when out zones are created, there'll be some amount of time before the commercial uses need to end. And I don't think we want to start getting into trying to use the exceptions as a way to avoid the intended outcome of opt-outs. I think that would not be a good productive path for us to pursue.
Question about the exceptions.
Casey
This
O'Neill.
is Anita.
Has left the conference.
Question about the exceptions is, would an exceptions be something that would allow one zoning type to operate as though it were another zoning type based on use and fit? So if somebody had been doing something and wanted to go into a different commercial industry, would exceptions allow them to do that on their parcel regardless of whether or not it wasn't zoning permissive?
Casey.
Has joined the conference.
We'll need to spend a little bit more time on that question. We've only touched on the range of uses that would be allowed through opt-in zones. And what we heard from the board is we're not trying to get the opportunity for a range of commercial cannabis uses. The board did acknowledge that some manufacturing, and it's the only term that I'm appropriate to use, but some processing of cannabis that's cultivated on site is appropriate. That's the cottage industry scale with limitations. But within the opt-in zone, the board was pretty clear that all they're really trying to do is protect local growers and allow them some limited ability to do some processing of their own locally on-site produced cannabis. When we start moving in the direction of the exceptions to allow uses other than cannabis that wouldn't otherwise have been allowed, commercial uses other than cultivation that would not have otherwise been allowed, that little bit different question, and we'll have to get direction, but that seems like the same question that the board responded to, that we're really not trying to open up saturated commercial uses. We're really trying to accommodate our growing community. That's the impression I got, but we're happy to, clarify as we move forward.
Thank you.
Thing is, I will say that in my experience as a planner, I've seen exceptions used in many agencies. I've never seen them applied to uses. I've only seen it applied to development standards. You have a requirement for a setback, it can be reduced a certain amount. You have a requirement for parking, it can be reduced. I've never seen, and I don't think it probably is appropriate to say through an exception will allow a commercial use that's not otherwise allowed. So I'm working through the question because it's a good question, but I'm pretty sure that exceptions won't be the path to all uses that otherwise are not allowed.
That's working towards a greater understanding of what the limits and of exceptions are.
You all are, honestly, and we're going to do this together. And we are happy to check in with the county, and I think that question actually even has some legal underpinnings to it that we'd want to check in, as well as the political decisions. So, great question, but not real easy to answer at the moment. So, Casey, getting the group back to kind of where we started, is it really the group's consensus that the uses allowed within the regulations for these various zones, whether it's R1, R2, RC, whatever, that the challenges are not related to the allowed uses, but rather are related to the standards, setbacks, things like that? Can we get a little more from the group about whether we're correctly understanding that?
Yeah.
And
Anira,
thanks. We are interested in hearing from the whole group, so thanks, Anira. Anyone else?
This is Penelope, and just going back to what Casey said about the sizes and RC being the issue. I have actually keep looking through what the county have put in their ordinance, and I still can't see that. I can't see RC mentioned, but I'll keep looking. It might be a bit more complicated than just size.
Penelope, you're saying not 100% sure. There may be some use level accommodations as well.
Yeah, like RC is still kind of missing from any mention. I did see it a long time ago mentioned as a sort of footnote, but I haven't actually seen it in any of the tables of use of this ordinance.
Right,
have a little bit of catching up to
we'll look back at that.
I will be doing that.
I'll get back at that. What else?
This is Jane. And if Paul, you share what I sent, there's specific information about some of what's allowed in the already there for Penelope to reference back to.
Thanks.
And I would agree and say that generally, yes, we're addressing more development standards, not as much use, with the one consideration for parcel size, potentially accommodating appropriate scale of cultivation relative to the acreage. So that would be, something that's allowed in other zones, and so applying that allowance into these zones through the overlay.
I think it's in line with some comments we heard from you, Anira, last week about when you have a larger parcel. Let's say you have a 10-acre parcel in an RR2 zone. Is any way that the allowed uses and really the scale of uses could be adjusted? So got down, and we'll keep looking at that. Let's see, Moni, anything you want to add?
I agree with what everyone's saying. I think ultimately it's just that everyone that's in these sunset zones, they're not able to continue forward because they're in those sunset zones. And we're talking cultivation, so of course manufacturing and those other elements wouldn't be allowed in these zone types. But we're talking about cultivation, so yeah. That's like the main issue. And also kind of interesting when you look at the ordinance, because it talked about RR5 having, you have to have 5-acre minimum to continue past the sunset. RR10, it's a little tricky, but that also says you have to have more than 2 acres to continue. But have to have 5 acres to do beyond the 2,500 square feet, and then of course 10 acres to do the 10,000 square feet. Some people are looking at that going, wait, that's interesting. RR5 has to have 5 acres to continue forward, but RR10 only has to have 2 acres to continue forward. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
And
So, thank you. So, yes, as we're moving forward, I mean, this is an issue at large with cultivation, but to be able to allow people to opt in to be able to do other types of production, in particular, I think most of the community I think of when I think of the opt-in are our true medicine makers, the ones that make the cures, the salves, the different products like that. So as we're growing this opportunity, that we make sure that we are keeping it on that, as well as their ability to do a micro business with whatever criteria that might happen. But again, those are questions that are happening at all cultivation sites. I just wanted to point that out for support that.
okay, thank you. Mark, do you want to help us talk about development standards a little bit and dig into that?
Yeah, so, just going back to what Paul mentioned, when we as Plant look at what your zone is or what a zone of a property is, we're looking at 2 things. And second, that we've spoken about allowed uses, and talking about development standards, which are, as Paul mentioned, what are setbacks, where can I either build or use land on my property. And, the things that really don't come into play, building height maybe, or coverage, but in this case, we're really focused on those setbacks. And, we just had that conversation. We're going to be addressing setbacks throughout the county with the exceptions group. And, I think I'm going to go more after the allowed uses component of what your zone is. How that falls out, we'll be seeing as we go through the process. I think that given the questions, everyone has a pretty good understanding of that. Anything else that we need to go through for that, or any other questions about where actions work that we're going to be doing, kind of how that separates out from this overlay zone process is?
And I have a question about that. My understanding of what you just said, Mark, is that the setbacks would be addressed as an exceptions element when it comes down to breaking down the different elements that are tasked and how they're developed in the process. And so I do, because when you look at some of the neighborhoods we're dealing with, one of the key elements in the overlay issue are the setbacks from our neighbors. We have a couple of different aspects that make that up: boundaries and neighborhood houses, how far our houses are. In the last meeting, you asked, do you guys experience crime? And in my North Road area, because we all work together, there's a very large level of consciousness within the neighborhood groups. We tend to cluster our gardens in the most rural area of our small properties so that everyone's kind of got each other's backs. At which point, considering setbacks is a key element of establishing a safe, functioning garden environment in a small community. And so I really look at that as not being a single parcel issue, but rather an aspect of the community parcel environment, and wonder if that's a appropriate designation for setbacks to be placed under the exceptions, or maybe an aspect of setback gets placed there, or would then somebody like my property in a small neighborhood, Laytonville, have to apply through 2 processes? Would we be considered in the overlay and then say, okay, we have 10 neighbors, we all need to go through the exceptions as individuals to deal with the setbacks? I'm kind of looking at how that works and
good question, and
expand my understanding.
The simple answer is no. If you're going to be in the opt-out area or within an opt-out area, there's going to be generally a great permissiveness for the commercial cultivated cannabis. The one exception will work is there will be a list of, say, I don't know yet. This is a very rough, state of how this will look or work, but a set of criteria. And go into in the zoning code, and you'll see, okay, if your parcel is X, and if your parcel meets Y consideration, then you will receive a certain percent reduction or relief from the code. So if your parcel meets, and we haven't worked with the group yet to determine what these kind of characteristics should be, but if your property meets following characteristics, then requirements, then you will be allowed a percentage reduction from the required setbacks. So that will exist out there, and we think in hearing a lot of some of the concerns that we've heard so far, some of that will be concerns out there for commercial will be by that process. Now we have this other process that we're here working on, and if you are now within a over area, we will also address development standards with this process, but and you will be within an area of great permissiveness for that cultivation. So it's very unlikely that you won't have to go back through that exceptions process. Paul, want to add that?
Yeah, I like where you wound up there, Mark, because I don't think setbacks will be solely addressed in either opt-in regular part or only in the exceptions. I think they'll actually be in both. We've started to tease this apart a little bit, and it may be that the exceptions that make sense on more of a county-wide basis is really an expansive landscape. Those exceptions may not make sense or resolve the issues when we focus in on a Laytonville, a Covelo, a community like that. So I think that we're going to have to address development standards in both of these areas, both in the exceptions and in the opt-in regulations.
Thank you.
Okay.
This is Monique. Penelope down
Penelope and Monique.
Quick one. In South Leggett, with the exceptions line, we're in RC, which is rural community. In that zoning, you are allowed light industry, and it just happens that my property was a hotel, a motel, cafe, a bar for like 40 years or something. And so I'm hoping that if there are exceptions, that you could even get an exception in the Sunset area, just to make it really complicated. We were looking for a cottage industry so we could run a micro business, I guess more eventually maybe a bud and breakfast with a bee farm at the back, like a micro winery or something, but cannabis. That was our idea initially, but the zoning we haven't been able to move forward. So the exceptions might be really complex throughout the county, but be worth allowing complex exceptions because there might be really possible business within those exceptions throughout or dotted along the county. So I just wanted to keep that in mind.
So let me give a point so the way we typically see exceptions implemented, they deal solely with the development standards of a property. They do not deal with uses. So,
okay, sorry.
Yeah, so, and this is important. So what uses are going to be what we're going to address with this group, with the other group. We're going to try to figure out or see how we can create an overlay zone that could, or carve out an area where these type of businesses can occur. The exceptions will most very only address here the siting of commercial cannabis activity can occur, or here is some relief that we can offer from the current constraints that exist for commercial cannabis activities if your property meets certain standards. Does that make sense, Penelope?
Thanks for the clarification.
Monique, I think you had something?
Yeah, I was just curious about the exceptions and all of that and how it's going to play out because of, you know, the sensitive receptor sites. That's a huge one for Covelo because it's wiping out most of downtown based on the school zoning, and then also have 10 churches. And some of them aren't even in operation, but the building is still standing. And then we have maybe a park, and most of the residential people live in that area. So when I had the county pull up a map, it just wiped out, many people. So, but my question, because we had this meeting last week, and it was that the school could potentially give a waiver saying, okay, we're going to allow this, which I have a feeling Covelo might be a candidate of that school here. I know that process, but I wonder how that will play into finding is, could this overlay area, but then because we have to get permission for this waiver, and would that be an exception? I'm not really sure how that's going to play into it. Or are these people just out? So, you know, that's my biggest concern is I'm looking at the data that I've been collecting and really capturing, like, how many parcels do we have in these sunset zones? How many would be eligible that are not triggered by the ballot setback of a school? And then looking to the state and their minimum requirements, we could reduce the setback to. The county is choosing to be more restrictive, but they could go to what the state allows as the restrictive, and I believe it's 600 feet. Well, that would capture more people getting able to be in the program. So I don't know where that falls into this.
It is a great comment, Monique, and as I understand it, and of course Paul's going to speak to this too, but as I understand it, Covelo is going to be one of our opt-in areas, and that is exactly what we anticipate the overlay being able to do. That would not actually be an exception area, but what we would say, and this is, you know, how the overlay gets established and how it gains public support or knowledge of the creation of this area still remains to be, you know, figured out. But you have this issue of sensitive receptors within the Covelo area, the Covelo community, through the work of the subgroup. You know, there's a determination that this area is candidate for opt-in, or is a good, you know, will become part of the opt-in overlay. Then we can then start to look at the very specific issues of how do we reduce, you know, these county requirements of separation from these sensitive receptor sites. One thing to keep in mind, and we did say this last week, we can't, anything that's state law will still be state law, and we'll still have to work within those bounds, you know, within the boundaries of state law. And yes, that is, you know, in another jurisdiction that we're working in, we have seen school waivers be delivered, and particularly if we're looking at an area that's going to be by opt-in, you know, and we can work with that school district, staff can work with that school district to obtain that waiver.
And then churches absolutely, like, in stone by the state for 1,000 feet as a buffer, because again, we have 10 churches in a tiny community, and again, all of them are even in operation, and one burnt down in November, so there's no structure even on the parcel anymore. So I wonder about that, because when I look at that, it's another huge issue, and because of the church, that is wiping out all of our industrial potential, all of our commercial potential properties, all right there. So and that's a separate issue, because I know this.
Church actually in the state.
Yeah, I didn't think so.
They're not.
Yeah.
Yeah,
cool,
so that's totally a county thing.
Well, I got lifted because then that right there, if we could just get that taken out as an exception maybe, I don't know if that would be an easier process, Covelo, that will just open up the door for so many people, like so many.
I don't want to, I just want to make sure that we're all aligned in our thinking. If we were to address this separation from sensitive receptor sites, specifically churches, the current standards are for 1,000-foot separation. That would not be part of the exception group. That would not run into that. The exceptions will apply to your parcel and what your setbacks are on your parcel. That would be something that we're going to work with in this opt-out group that we seek to address with the opt-out overlay. And I really want to...
Wait.
Sorry.
Opt-out or opt-in? I'm confused.
Yeah, we're all opting in.
I apologize.
We're all doing that occasionally. Just with... Casey, thanks for clarifying, because that had also been my understanding that the state regs do not include the church setback. So that, to me, is fair game for discussion. And that could come in the form of relief offered within an opt-in zone, that regulation that applies more broadly in the county does not apply within opt-in zones. Or it could actually just come from deciding, yeah, we adopted this standard and we really don't need it. This isn't really helping us in any way. So there's different ways that separation requirement could be addressed. But I think, Mark, you're spot on that's probably not an exceptions thing. Either change the regs or create areas where that particular regulation doesn't apply.
Couple quick thoughts. I do think that it does make sense to try to pursue an ordinance amendment to adjust or to reduce or remove the inclusion of churches in the setbacks, the receptor setbacks. I think it'll be a difficult political battle, but I think it's one that we might want to consider. And then the other thing, just briefly, that I was going to add, I've been sort of scanning back through the ordinances, and I think that Penelope is right. Rural communities is listed only in a sunset zone, and so it's my read on it right now, and I'm a little unclear, but my read on it right now is that regardless of parcel size, if you're in RC, you're considered in a sunset zone, and